this civil war has already started. And let me give you 3 examples that fits in with the scenario you just painted.
Use infrastructural attack on the life support systems of the major cities with a view to causing cascading crises. I think that the Islamist threat is probably close to the limit of its potential in British society, of the existence of two-tier policing and generally unequal application of the law.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest is a professor from King's College in London, Professor David Betz, who studies war. I didn't even know you could study war at university, but what do I know? I've never been to university. First of all, David, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for your invitation. I'm glad to be.
You've been popping up on my YouTube feed recently, this last 3 weeks, 4 weeks maybe. And the title is always along the lines of English Civil War. Is a civil war coming? What can we do to stop a civil war? It's always civil war. And that's what made me click on it in the first place. It's something I've talked about a little bit and thought about a little bit over the last few years. A couple of years ago, I thought, not a chance in hell. We don't do that in this country. We're too sensible. But over the last few years, I felt the anger, the frustration from just normal people who I deal with. And I'm beginning to think we're in a bigger problem than we thought we were. Tell me a little bit about studying war and the civil war aspects of it. What would a civil war look like in modern UK?
Right. So, well, studying war, yes, you can study war. There's a long-standing, the UK is home to the War Studies Department, which is a long-standing academic institution, relatively unique in the world, but fairly large and well-respected. And I've been part of that for about 25 years now. My area of specialism really is foreign wars, because that's been the preoccupation of, most Britons about war for all of this time. I'm particularly a specialist on irregular warfare, insurgency, and related elements of that. And about, I guess, approximately 8 years, and in which role I'd written very widely, a number of books, many articles. I've advised governments, including the British, American, and others over the years on these subjects. And my interest in this originated probably about 8 years ago, perhaps a little bit longer, when I began to recognize in our own government, in our own forms of governance, aspects of what the literature on insurgency and counterinsurgency would suggest is a country that is in a significant crisis of legitimacy, which is fundamentally what drives in internal conflict. What would it look like in the UK? Well, probably the best way of getting at this really is you have to understand the way in the study of classical insurgency, probably the most well-known version of that is derived from the thoughts and writing of Mao Zedong. And so when people talk about classical insurgency, they are usually referring to a 3-phase model that was first articulated by Mao. The first phase is the defensive. This is a phase in which the insurgents are very weak relative to the state, and they're mostly involved in political organization, in propagandization. They're not typically doing attacks, but if they are, they are a very low level. The second phase is usually described as the stalemate, and that's where the insurgency begins to break the surface. You see attacks occurring, but they are in the nature of hit and run attacks, ambushes, the like. There's still heavy political organization going on. So there is a kind of revolutionary violence bubbling up, but it is not yet a conventional symmetric sort of conflict. The third phase is essentially a conventional symmetric conflict in which looks a lot like a normal war. Many civil wars in the past have concluded in favor of the insurgent without having proceeded to a full-blown phase three. Equally, some have jumped from normal politics directly to phase three in one go. The American Civil War of the mid-19th century would be an example of that. In the case at hand, I think two issues are highly pertinent. Firstly, scenarios of a full-blown phase three symmetrical civil war are very implausible in the case of Britain on account of the fact that the fissures in British society don't align with geographically politically defined identities. The legitimacy of the British government, of the central government, will decline to zero long before any such identities solidify and acquire a competitive state-like character. So I don't expect that. Secondly, the threat to existing authority is sharply bifurcated. You have, on the one hand, two forces. There is a long-established Islamist movement, which has a demonstrated organization and capability to conduct strategically meaningful violence, but it has little mass potential on account of the fact that its conscience community is a minority within British society. On the other hand, there is the emerging nativist movement. It's not the best term for it, but it is probably the one we have to go for at the moment. So you have this emerging nativist movement, which is currently very ill organized, has little demonstrated violent capability, despite how much it is talked about, but it has significant mass potential on account of its appeal to the ideals of the titular nationality, i.e. of the majority population. So I think if you take this into account, or look at this from the government's point of view, the government's efforts to contain and to mitigate the threat of Islamist terrorism includes measures like intrusive surveillance, target hardening of the broader civil milieu, so, bollards around Christmas markets and on bridges and the like, that people recognize. These are costly, they're frequently irksome, they are increasingly perceived as injurious to people's civil liberty, their expectations of privacy, and so on. Similarly, the government's efforts to co-opt, or at least not to further inflame the Muslim population, give charges in the broader society, give substance rather to charges within the broader society of the existence of two-tier policing and generally unequal application of the law. These things are very damaging to civil comity, to perception of legitimacy, and so on. So in effect, the government now is stuck in a series of interlocking traps that are social in origin, that are aggravated by economic exigency or stringency, and out of which the government cannot extricate itself in respect of one category of threat without aggravating its difficulties in respect of the other. In terms of the frame outlined above, I think that the Islamist threat is probably close to the limit of its potential in British society, somewhere towards the lower part of phase two, whereas the nativist threat is somewhere in the middle of phase one, at a fraction of its actual potential. The character of the Civil War that is about, that I believe is likely to occur, is probably in the first instance to look something rather like the dirty wars of Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, also to some extent of parts of Europe in that period of time. your listeners may recognize the term "the years of lead," which was the phrase used to describe the Italian experience of this. And here we have a conflict the sort of conflict which features widespread but long-term, low-grade attacks, typically in the shape of tit-for-tat, kidnapping, assassination, general intimidation, as well as potentially occasional gruesome public displays of violence, like the dangling of corpses from highways, highway overpasses, and the like, which has been fairly typical of Mexican cartels. As dreadful as that will be, it's not the most worrisome aspect, worrisome strategy that will be employed, in my view. And finally, I'll just come to the end here, which are probably a fairly long explication, but I am coming to the end. I think the strategy that anti-status quo groups are going to gravitate towards ultimately will be to use infrastructural attack on the life support systems of the major cities with a view to causing cascading crises, sustained and widespread power outages, interruptions of the gas supply, disruption of the mass transit and the like, with the hope of causing a set of cascading crises leading to systemic failure and a period ultimately of mass chaos in which there is substantial population movement, which can be harnessed towards a significant alteration of the status quo. The plausible application of this strategy should not be dismissed. This is what I urge people to understand. There's nothing in what I have just said that is particularly controversial or difficult from a tactical point of view, or that is not perfectly well understood and described in open literature. It aligns with the conclusions that have been drawn by people in urban studies about the tenuous balance of the urban condition under normal circumstances. And it's certainly an idea which has been significantly and persistently discussed within anti-status quo circles for at least the last 10 years since I have been following it. Fundamentally, the cities, the UK cities, many of which are essentially semi-feral already in terms of, I use a term derived again from the military literature, in that case, an essay from the United States in the early 2000s describing something called the feral city, which is a city that is fundamentally ungoverned. And there are many aspects of many British cities, it must be said, not only British cities, which already are at least giving warning signs on the ferality scale. So that's essentially what I think it is going to look like. Firstly, something a bit like Dirty Wars, but metastasizing into a larger and more dramatic development, chiefly through the use of infrastructural attack on the life support systems of the major cities, which will have significant effect.
Interesting. Let me put this to you, that this civil war has already started. And let me give you 3 examples that fits in with the scenario you just painted. The first one is Islamic terrorism. That has attacked infrastructure, the London Underground, transport, and that has definitely driven a wedge in the country between Muslims and everybody else. And the feeling against Muslims now is exploding across the country because we see those people now as the enemy. That's my first point. My second point is Just Stop Oil, the eco-green lunatics who bring traffic to a stop, who stop ambulances, get into hospitals, who attack our culture, works of art. And I've had a theory about them for quite a while, that even though they're so-called peaceful, I feel they're waiting for someone to take the law in their own hands and hurt them or run them over or kill them, for them to use that as an excuse for them to go to the next stage, which is, we're going to go to violence now and you drew first blood on us. And the third example would be attacking the state. Isn't that what they're called Blade Runners are doing in London, chopping down the ULEZ towers and the cameras? That's a direct attack upon the state, the infrastructure, the surveillance. If you put those three things together, has the civil war already started, but at a lower level?
Yes, I tend to agree with that point of view. I think in the course of time, some decades from now, when we look back at this period, it may well, and historians are writing up the history of this period of Britain, actually of the Western world more generally. I think they are bound to conclude that in most of the significant ways that the Civil War had already begun at this stage. I fully agree with the 3 points you have made, but particularly I think that the latter one, I think what the Blade Runners and the attacks on the ULEZ system have demonstrated in a kind of larval form is the essence of the critical infrastructural attack strategy, which I described. And there are certain things that one can draw from that. Firstly, they've been very successful. Whoever these people are,
and popular.
Yes, that's right. Popular and successful. They're often and we know they're popular because often they're operating in plain sight. Literally, there are cars and people walking by and probably, patting them on the back, say, "Good on you, take it down. I don't want it." So that is worrisome. That from a security perspective, if you're thinking about how to defeat this strategy, even in a very larval form, the ability of the state to fight back against this has been not terribly significant. In political terms, moreover, I think we've already crossed the tipping point. According to UK Parliament's own research, as of 2023, which is the last time I looked at, the Parliament's own research on social attitudes, it was determined that 60% of British respondents to the survey done agreed with the statement that politicians don't care. I'm going to go out on a limb and say if that research was done in 2025, it would be a bigger number. I think I would struggle. I see you nodding. I would probably struggle to find a single person who would agree with the statement that politicians or disagree with the statement that politicians don't care. In that same piece of research, it was found that just 12% of British adults trust in political parties. So on every level, and as we've seen across a range of issues, but I think most tellingly in the context of the current discussion around the potential of bringing back conscription and the reaction of normal British people to this idea, we're seeing very distinctive sign that the sense of British pre-political loyalty has essentially been eroded almost to zero. And those things didn't happen. We're not waiting for those things to happen, and they didn't just happen yesterday. They actually they are the result of processes that are in some cases actually decades long, and had uh, uh, been achieved some already some years behind us. So when a government's perceived legitimacy drops to the extent that that it has demonstrably, as I've just said, in Britain, that is a very serious indicator of a desperate illness of that society, and it's already occurred. So fundamentally, I agree with your statement. One might reasonably say that it has already begun, and I think that some of the within government, I think this is probably also recognized in places, certainly within the cleverer quarters of the security services. All of this is well understood. These are people who've spent the last 25 years understanding, trying, and largely succeeding in understanding insurgency and counterinsurgency. The novelty is just thinking about it in terms of one's own country. But once you get over that hump, it's all pretty obvious. So I think within government, surely there are people who are looking at this situation, and with a no doubt a sinking feeling of frustrated urgency. I say urgency because it's a tremendously important problem. Frustrated because there's simply no evidence whatsoever that the actual elected government is doing anything useful about this. In fact, quite the opposite. They seem to be following a textbook entitled "How to Create a Civil War in Your Own Country."
If we are in a civil war, and if it's going to get worse, who are going to be the sides? The three examples I gave then was disaffected drivers, Islamists, and eco-greens. Where are these fractures going to occur? Is it going to be, I don't foresee whites against blacks. I don't foresee Christians against Muslims. How's it going to play out? Who are going to be the enemies, or is it going to be like Mogadishu, where it's tribal, and there's you can split it into 15 different groups, or is it going to be two groups like the royalists and the parliamentarians in our first civil war? How is that looking?
Well, it's very sad when you think about it, but let me explain what I think is going to happen. It's sad because I think fundamentally the most important fissure is between nationalism and post-nationalism. Nationalism is in bad odor and has been, in elite circles since the World Wars, really. But essentially, if one understands it as a love of one's place and people, and then that idea, I think that idea is one that appeals to Britons across a range of ethnicities. And so, I mean, it's very, the problem is, and if you think of it that way, then the problem is that we have our elite, our political media, certainly our corporate elite, they're all post-nationalist in their orientation. They don't think in terms of national interest. In fact, they're suspicious of people who talk about national interest. They think there's something actually disreputable about that. Rather suspicious, and basically morally suspect to talk in those terms.
And Keir Starmer perfectly highlighted this when someone asked him on the BBC, "What do you prefer, Davos or Westminster?" And he went, "Davos."
Keir Starmer is the epitomization of this, I think. But I mean, he's hardly alone. I mean, he's an epitomization of an ideal that is very broadly, I think, evident throughout the British establishment. I apologize for this. I have an elderly dog at my feet here. So, in essence, one might say, in the first instance, the conflict is between the post-nationalist elite and the remaining nationalist community. Let's call it society. But I don't think it's going to remain that way, and that's because of the deranging effect of violence. Once things tip over into violence, then it becomes much more difficult for people to exercise essentially what's known in the jargon as bridging capital. Bridging capital is the kind of capital that exists within a society that allows otherwise disparate groups to work together to see commonality despite whatever superficial differences there may be. Once the violence breaks out and people are fleeing the cities because they're falling apart, they'll begin to sort themselves, and almost invariably they will sort themselves on ethnic lines, which is why it's so sad, why it's so depressing, and what's being set off is a chain of events that, by any definition, is tragic and offensive to almost everyone in the country, barring a handful of extremists. But the truth of the matter is that it's perfectly obvious, perfectly well understood to extremists on both sides how to take small fractures in society and tear them into giant chasms. That's all. This far into the war on terror, people understand how to do that. They will begin to do it.
Interesting. Now because you've said it out loud, I'm now thinking you're right. Once that violence hits, we go back to our animal instincts, which is tribalism. And it's like, I need to be.
You use the word tribal, and I think that is the correct one. I mean, within the social sciences, within academia, people have been talking about tribalization and retribalization for a long time. Again, it's not terribly controversial. The controversial bit of it is when you simply, when you connect the dots between the developments, this tribalization which is occurring in society, and again, just perfectly obvious. I mean, perfectly obviously, I think it's only controversial when you connect the dots. The individual elements, I mean, they're all well understood. I have no doubt that many of your listeners, for a lot of your listeners, everything I'm saying is pretty obvious. For some of your listeners, it's just glaringly obvious. And for some, perhaps it's not so obvious. But I think most people perceive the things that I perceive occurring, the things that I've just mentioned. They just perhaps haven't heard them articulated in a particular manner.
No, spot on. I think that's it. When you hear people say things, sometimes automatically you say to yourself, I know that to be true. I've just not articulated it myself. I've not heard anybody else put the case for it. But deep down inside, I know that's true because I feel it to be true. Now, the Western UK, we have enemies. We've always had enemies. It's part of human nature. Is there an external influence in what's going on in the UK in this degrading of our social trust? Have foreign powers created this, such as the Cold War, China, North Korea, Iran, or are they taking advantage of it? Because I know for a fact we mess in other people's countries, they're bound to be messing in ours.
I think there is external influence, but it's not in the way that you suggest. So there is external influence because we live in an information society in which in which the ideas, the apprehensions, the concerns, the events which occur at very far distant places impact upon us now in a very regular, very rapid manner. So, for instance, the Black Lives Matter protests, which originate in the United States in an event occurring where in Detroit, I think. Where was the Floyd killing? Minnesota. Right. So you have an event occurring in Minnesota that 2 months later is manifesting in Bristol with a riot that sees a statue thrown into the harbor. So clearly there is external influence on this, and many of the ideas that I'm talking about, these are not uniquely British ideas. These are ideas that are essentially floating around in our global kind of infosphere and impact upon British society. What I don't think there is evidence for is Russian or Chinese manipulation of obvious problems in British society. I hear this talked about, but I've certainly seen no sign of that. For my own part, if I attempt to look at the situation from the perspective of Russia or China, do I want this to occur in Britain, France, let alone the United States? Generally speaking, no. For the same reasons, we don't want to see civil war. We didn't want to see civil war occur in Russia in the middle of the 1990s when this seemed very plausible. We did not want to see that because it's perfectly obvious what the consequences are. Civil wars generate insecurity that just emanates out from, and so a big important place like Russia going into civil war would have had big effects on us. Likewise, Britain going into civil war. Britain is a nuclear power. We've got multiple nuclear power stations. We've got all kinds of infrastructure that, if left unguarded or neglected or whatever, could have big, powerful effect. So I don't see Russia and China being involved in the sense of precipitating this conflict. It wasn't Russia that invented the idea of multiculturalism and made British governments adopt it over a generation. It wasn't the Russian Ministry of Education that said, well, we're no longer going to teach British civics. These are all native ideas. We did that to ourselves. Okay. Now, which is not to say, however, that when this occurs and Britain does become a very significantly weakened entity because it is so tragically ill, which is one way I think you could metaphorically describe this situation, that foreign powers would not take an advantage. After all, in the 19th century, when China was in its period of civil wars, that was the beginning of China's century of humiliation, so-called, in which it was subject to a bunch of very uneven treaties and the like that it simply couldn't resist because it didn't have the organic strength to resist foreign. So I don't think it's occurred yet in the form that you suspect, but when it does happen, when we do break down openly, I think there will be very significant potential for foreign interference that could be very disagreeable.
David, I have to ask you my last question. My last question is, can anything be done? Is this a one-way road? Are we going to hit a civil war? It might be a small one, a big one, we don't know. Can it be stopped? If it can be stopped, do we have the right politicians in this country to change course, to do the things that need to be done? And what are those things that would have to be done?
I have to say that I'm past the point now of thinking that this can be stopped. And that is, and the reason I say that relates to this second or third part of your question. Do we have the sorts of politicians who could do this? And the answer is no. We don't. In some respects, what I've just described as a civil war, others might say, well, look, this looks like a peasant revolt. This is more like a revolution. And I think actually that's a valid remark that I've heard from time to time. And if you do think of it in terms of revolt, well, you have a revolt when people have determined essentially that the situation cannot be changed internally, that the status quo cannot heal itself, that you cannot solve the situation through normal politics. And again, the British government's own research on this matter is very clear that people do not believe that on average, a majority of Britons do not believe that politics can solve problems in society. So if one simply accepts this, which I do, then it makes no logical sense to believe that politics is somehow going to just come up with solutions to this. Even without reading a newspaper or looking into what the government is actually doing at this time. If you do, however, go and look at what government is actually doing, then the situation is that much worse, because it's not just that they're not capable; they're clearly not interested. There is no single sign, I feel, on the part of the current government, and it must be said also of the previous government, that they are likely to do anything that is useful, or even to begin to behave neutrally with respect to aggravating the problem. So I don't feel that much can be done. I also, I am a bit going to dodge your question. I mean, I don't think that maybe you can ask a political scientist, but I don't think a professor of war studies is probably an individual professor of war studies is probably the right person to ask how to heal what is a very significant societal issue. I think, if anything, and I feel it's very unlikely that the answer to the problem you pose is going to emerge from academia. If anything is going to work, it is that society is going to heal itself. Now, this may make some people very nervous, because they might conclude that civil war is the answer. And ultimately I feel actually, again, that probably most people are going to conclude that, hence its inevitability. But if there is an answer that is not a violent social rupture, then it has to emerge organically from society, and for that to occur, we have to bring this problem out into the open. It must be discussed openly. The tendency of people, perhaps particularly British people, to kind of look away from unpleasantness and tend to think, well, it'll all work out in the end. That has to stop, I feel. The matter has to be brought into the light of day, and people need to be impressed with the full potential of the situation to develop in ways that are very tragic for the country and quite possibly for them personally, and then perhaps we might see emerging ideas about how it can be prevented. But as I said, from a personal point of view, I am skeptical of this, of the potential of this. I'd basically give it at best a 50-50.
50-50, wow. I agree with you to a certain extent, as in, if we're looking, and this is what we've been doing for 50 years now, we keep looking towards the government to fix our problems. And every decade, the government makes everything worse and worse and worse. And now we're heading to civil war. And if we keep looking towards the government to fix this, then we are going to have a civil war. We need people of this country to start rejecting the big state and start fixing their own lives, their own communities. And from that, we may avoid the civil war and end up with a better country. David, any last thoughts before we go?
No, I think you've given an optimistic point of view there, or at least a hopeful point of view, and I don't really feel like pouring cold water on that.
No. Thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sparing the time coming on my small channel to talk about this. And it's an extremely serious subject, and you've given me a lot to think about. So for that, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Nick, and thanks very much for the invitation, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.